The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Economist Emmanuel Saez on how America's tax system is pushing us deeper into inequality. Ian Haney Lopez on why the fight for racial justice will win elections. Plus, Tom Friedman tells Bill Press why Trump must be impeached. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Economist Emmanuel Saez studies wealth and income inequality around the world. His newest book argues that the American economy isn't working for half of the nation and makes the case for a tax system that is truly progressive. And we say hello to Emmanuel Saez, who's the director of the Center for Equitable Growth at the University of California at Berkeley. He is currently editor of the Journal of Public Economics and co-director of the Public Policy Program at the Center for Economic Policy and Research. He's also the co-author with Gabriel Zuckman of The Triumph of Injustice: How the Rich Dodge Taxes and How to Make Them Pay. Emmanuel Saez, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Very happy to be here with you today.
And our pleasure to be speaking with you today as well. You've written this book at a unique moment in American history. Income inequality is at the highest level ever recorded. And there, of course, are a lot of numbers that we could use to illustrate this, but what is the most powerful way to convey inequality today?
So I think that the most powerful way to see this is to realize that the economy is not working for the bottom half of the population. So when we crunch the numbers, we saw that in spite of macroeconomic growth, that is on average incomes have grown 60% since 1980, for the bottom half of the population on a pre-tax basis, their incomes have pretty much stagnated. So that's the most striking fact. An economy that doesn't work for half the country is just not on a sustainable path. And the fact that incomes are not growing at the bottom means that incomes are growing disproportionately at the top, with the share of income going to the top 1%, doubling from 10% in 1980 to about 20% today.
Well, and there's something else that you note, that in 2018, the ultra-rich paid a smaller portion of their income in taxes than average Americans. Give us a sense of that disparity.
Yes, so we crunched the numbers in our book, where we computed taxes relative to income by income group, and we included not only taxes at the federal level, but also at the state and local level. And so when you pile up all the taxes, you realize that the U.S. tax system is not nearly as progressive as you might think. That is, the low-income folks pay a significant share of their income, about 25% in taxes, that it increases all the way to the middle class and the upper middle class to about 30%. And then what's very striking is that at the very top, when you're thinking really the billionaire class, the tax rates are falling. And so we've estimated that in 2018, the tax rate paid by the top 400 is 23%, lower than for any other income group.
Wow. You mentioned the progressive tax system, and I want to talk to you more about that. But before we do that, I want to point out that part of this book is the history of how we got here. And you make it clear that our tax system today is a result of clear decisions made by lawmakers. What are some of the most significant decisions?
Yes. So the U.S. is the country that invented very progressive taxation in the first part of the 20th century, and for a long time, up to the 1970s, the U.S. had probably the most progressive tax system in the world, where the rich and the ultra-rich were paying much, much higher rates than the average. Now, what happened is that around 1980, with the election of Ronald Reagan, the view changed about whether the rich should contribute more, to the public good. The government was seen as a problem, and so what the Reagan administration did is that it stopped essentially enforcing taxes on the very rich, so that a number of tax avoidance, tax evasion strategies developed, and then a few years later, the Reagan administration turned around and told the Democrats, look, taxing the rich doesn't work anymore, and therefore it doesn't make sense to have those high nominal rates on paper. Let's cut taxes and close loopholes, and that's how the tax progressivity was undermined, and that phenomenon was repeated for the corporate tax in very recent years. That the Trump administration cut the corporate tax from 35% to 21% in 2018. So the strategy to undermine tax progressivity is to first let tax avoidance, evasion fester, and then say it's impossible to tax the rich, so we have to cut their tax rates.
Now, with your work, help us to understand these decisions. Is it that politicians are beholden to the wealthy contributors who get them elected, or is it more that they actually believe that the way taxes are now structured is best for our country?
I think it's a mix of both. That is, you have powerful private interests, wealthy contributors who don't want a wealth tax, don't want a very progressive income tax, big businesses who don't want a corporate tax, that are going to use their economic power to influence politicians, and more broadly society. And the way they do it is to influence society is also by developing think tanks who are going to build ideas, ways of seeing the world where the story is that taxes on the rich are bad for the economy, and everybody would benefit from having lower taxes on the rich. And here I should say that economists have played a key role in really disseminating that view that taxing the rich has become impossible, that taxing big corporations is bad for economic growth.
We're speaking with Emmanuel Saez, director of the Center for Equitable Growth at the University of Berkeley, or University of California at Berkeley, currently the editor of the Journal of Public Economics, co-director of the Public Policy Program at the Center for Economic Policy and Research, and co-author with Gabriel Zuckman of The Triumph of Injustice, How the Rich Dodge Taxes and How to Make Them Pay. A few moments ago, Emmanuel, we talked about the progressive tax system, and most Americans would say that we still have a progressive tax system, but your work established that as more myth than fact. So what are most of us missing?
That is, people typically, when they think about taxes, think about the individual income tax because they file a tax return every year. And it is true that individual income tax is actually progressive in the sense that bottom income earners typically don't owe any individual income tax. And the tax rate as a fraction of income increases at the top. So what this misses, though, is two things. First, there are many other taxes than the individual income tax, and in particular, there are payroll taxes that start on the first dollar of earnings, about 15%, and there are also sales and excise taxes, primarily at the state and local level, that you have to pay on any good you purchase, and that hit the poor who spend their full incomes on consumption that cannot afford to save much harder than the rich. So overall, when you pile them up, as I said before, the system is kind of only very mildly progressive. And then at the very top, the reason why the individual income tax fails, it's because it is based only on realized income. Now, if you're a multi-billionaire, like take the example of Warren Buffett, who's disclosed the numbers, you have 65 billion in wealth through, shares of your company, Berkshire Hathaway. So Berkshire Hathaway makes a lot of profits. You will pay some corporate taxes on those profits, not that much anymore, but then if the company doesn't distribute you dividends, and if you don't sell your shares, you effectively don't have to realize income, and therefore you don't pay individual income tax. And indeed, with a wealth of 65 billion, the corresponding income is like 5% of that, so maybe 3 billion, and yet Warren Buffett disclosed that his reported income and his individual income tax return was only about 10 to 20 million, which is orders of magnitude smaller than his true economic income because he can keep his profits inside the corporation. And that's why the tax rate at the very top is lower.
It's stunning to hear those numbers as you speak about them. And I think people sometimes get lost in the fact that we're talking millions. Oh, he paid millions of dollars of taxes, but based on the fact that it was on billions of dollars of income, it's a very different story. So let's now talk about solutions. You argue for a far more progressive tax system than what we have now. What are some of the concrete policies that would accomplish this?
Yes, so the main point we make in the book for the people to understand is that tax progressivity is possible if we want it, and it has happened in the historical record as I described earlier, and we could do it again. That is, globalization, technological progress don't impede the development of tax progressivity. You just have to adapt to the modern world, refine the tools, adapt the tax tools, and make tax progressivity work. So the concrete policies that we describe in the book is the wealth tax that we can discuss in more detail in a minute, and fixing the corporate tax. That is, currently multinationals can essentially avoid most of the corporate tax by parking their profits in tax havens because we let them do it. There are simple ways that we could impose taxes on multinationals based on their global profits, regardless of where they report those profits, and that effectively would allow to fix the corporate income tax. So those are the two main examples we discuss in the book.
Well, you mentioned the wealth tax. I guess it is a central part of your thinking. How would it work?
So a wealth tax is a tax that is based on the total wealth, the sum of assets net of debts that a family has. And so the wealth tax, as they've been proposed by candidates, is to apply it only on very wealthy families, so above 50 million in the case of the Elizabeth Warren wealth tax proposal. So it's really a tax that targets the super wealthy, and the tax would be a couple percent above 50 million, perhaps with some graduation for billionaires. So it's obviously a tax that hits only the wealthy, and that's very clear to everybody. You don't need to be an expert to understand that the tax is going to hit the wealthy. And second, it is the most powerful tool to really restore tax progressivity, because at the very top of the income distribution, most of the income comes from wealth. So there is a lot of wealth there, and the wealth is there independently of how you realize income. So if you put a wealth tax, say, of 2%, and if Warren Buffett has a wealth of, say, 65 billion, he would have to pay 2% of that, which is something like already, more than 1 billion in taxes. That is orders of magnitude what he pays for the income tax.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, there are arguments, and one of the arguments against your proposals is that greater taxes on wealth would be difficult to enforce, and it would invite evasion. How do you respond to that?
Yes, so this is indeed a very important question, and it's true that if you look at the experience of European countries who've had wealth taxes there have mostly failed. Either they didn't raise that much revenue, or they were totally abandoned, that is, repealed. Our response is that whether a wealth tax will work or not is going to depend on how it is designed and how it is enforced. So to take just a simple example, say in France that just abolished its wealth tax 2 years ago, it was very easy to avoid it because if you moved to London, after 1 year, you were no longer liable for the French wealth tax. In contrast, the U.S. has a tax system based on citizenship. That is, as long as you remain a U.S. citizen, you have to pay the wealth tax, the U.S. wealth tax, no matter where you live. And even if you renounce your citizenship, you would have to face a very strong exit tax. Europe was also very weak at enforcing the tax with regard, to offshore tax evasion. It was very easy for the French to put their money in Swiss bank accounts, and Switzerland didn't report anything to French authorities. The U.S. has cracked down a lot on offshore tax evasion, actually under the Obama administration, by passing a law, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, that requires any foreign financial institution to report accounts held by U.S. Residents to the IRS under a strong penalty. So all that shows you that those aspects are going to be critical in making the wealth tax work, and we think that if it is well designed, it could work. And that's why actually it's scaring so much, billionaires and many people on the right. If they thought this wealth tax is going to be a nothing burger, they wouldn't be so worried about it. But the fact that they are so worried tells you that if done well, it can really make a difference.
Yeah, if they're talking about it, they're definitely nervous about it. That's for sure. Before we let you go, candidates Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have integrated some of your ideas into their campaign platforms. Some may view that as a risky political move on their part. To what extent do you believe American voters are ready for an overhaul of our tax policy?
I think American voters perceive that the system doesn't work, especially for bottom-income earners. The expression is that the system is rigged. So they have a sense that the economy is not working, and they are looking for solutions. And actually, when you poll voters, taxing the rich more is very popular. And in particular, the wealth tax hitting the rich is popular. Even a majority of Republicans voters think that would be a good idea. So actually, if you look at how the primary has unfolded, when Elizabeth Warren proposed her wealth tax in January, it certainly gave a big boost to her campaign, because for the first time that was a tax policy that was clear, very easy to understand, where the goal and the means were really well aligned and easy for everybody to grasp. So I think there is a real demand for more tax progressivity, and indeed in this campaign you are seeing candidates, so Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren certainly, but also Mayor Pete to some extent, proposing tax platforms that are much more progressive than what we've seen from major candidates in decades.
It will be interesting to see what happens in 2020 and beyond, certainly. Emmanuel Saez, the director of the Center for Equitable Growth at the University of California at Berkeley, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. He is co-author with Gabriel Zuckman of The Triumph of Injustice, How the Rich Dodge Taxes and How to Make Them Pay. Emmanuel, we very much appreciate your time with us today on the America's Democrats podcast. We'd love to have you back and talk some more about it sometime in the future.
Thank you very much, Jim.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America. Whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, Ian Haney Lopez on fusing race and class, winning elections, and saving America. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his Common Sense commentary.
While Donald Trump fans the embers of xenophobia in our country by demonizing caravans of desperate Latinos headed north from Central America, there are other northern-bound caravans he doesn't mention. These are U.S. citizens crossing our northern border into Canada, seeking relief from the profiteering cartels that run our country's predatory healthcare system. Specifically, these people are among the millions of Americans who've literally been sickened by the price gouging of pharmaceutical giants. For example, the Washington Post reports that from 2012 to 2016, drug makers have nearly doubled the U.S. price of life-saving insulin. It's a massive highway robbery that Trump and company ignore, even though it creates a financial strain so severe that many patients try cheating death by skipping some dosages, an always dangerous gamble. Outraged and desperate, many diabetics and their families are taking matters into their own hands by making cross-border drug runs into towns just north of the U.S.-Canadian line. They're drawn there by Canada's single-payer healthcare system, which protects consumers from price gouging. As the Post reported, one small group of Minnesotans recently caravaned from their home into an Ontario border town where they could buy a supply of insulin for about $1,200 versus the $12,000 they would have been charged in the U.S. Good for them, but why should anyone in our incomparably rich nation have to make border raids to get essential health care? As the organizer of this Minnesota caravan put it, when you have a bad health care system, it makes good people feel like outlaws. It's demeaning, it's demoralizing, it's unjust. This is Jim Hightower saying, we the people must rise up, organize, and mobilize to make health care profiteering unacceptable, illegal, and un-American.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. In his newest book, critical race theorist Ian Haney Lopez offers a roadmap to progressive political victory. To get there, he argues, we need to reframe the way we think about race and class. And we say hello to Ian Haney Lopez, law professor at the University of California, Berkeley, where he teaches in the areas of race and constitutional law. He is the author of Merge Left, Fusing Race and Class, Winning Elections, and Saving America. And Dog Whistle Politics, how coded racial appeals have reinvented racism and wrecked the middle class. He also co-founded the Race Class Narrative Project and also co-chaired the AFL-CIO's Advisory Council on Racial and Economic Justice. Ian Haney Lopez, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Well, thank you so much for engaging me in this important conversation.
Well, our pleasure to have you with us. There's a long-standing debate within the Democratic Party. You describe it as a colorblind approach to politics versus a race-forward framework. To begin with, how do you define the colorblind approach?
Well, let's start with why this debate. The important point, we can say much more about this, but the important point is that Democrats have understood that since Richard Nixon at least, so since 1968 at least, the Republican Party's primary strategy for winning votes has been a racial one, to communicate a message of racial conflict and racial threat in the United States. And the Democrats have had to decide how best to respond. Now, in the context of that crucial question, how do you respond when the Republican strategy is to use race to splinter Democratic coalition to win votes? How do you respond? In the context of that question, Democrats have divided roughly in terms of two principal answers. One says, listen, if we talk about Republican race baiting, we actually play into their hands and lose votes. So let's go colorblind. And colorblind in this context means we as Democrats should focus on things that unite us. Maybe it's healthcare, maybe it's a living wage or infrastructure. But in any event, let's not talk about the things that divide us like race. And so to be crystal clear, a colorblind answer is a racial strategy. It's a strategy that says the best way to deal with racial division is to ignore race altogether. Right? So that's one answer, and you can see that across the history of the Democratic candidates. You can see it today in 2019. Another response is a race-forward response, and that response is to say, hey, we need to tackle this racial division head-on. We need to name it. We need to emphasize the offensiveness of what the Republicans are doing. We need to call out the racism. We also need to emphasize racial justice and the concerns of communities of color. And you can see segments of the Democratic Party and many progressives saying that's the approach we need to take.
What are the core ideas then that define the race forward agenda?
You know, I think the core idea there is we are being racially divided. We've got to name it. It doesn't work to simply ignore it. And indeed, when we try and ignore it, Democrats tend to slip into a pattern of actually pandering to racial resentment. So it's not just that the colorblind response says, hey, we're going to ignore it. The colorblind response shades into this other sort of response that says, we should reassure people that the Democratic Party is going to keep you safe, too. So, for example, you think about Donald Trump, and he's going on and on about building a wall. We can see with just a little bit of remove, a wall's not going to change anything. It's going to make things a lot worse. It symbolizes the fear and resentment towards immigrants, but it has no practical benefit. The Democrats could say that and say, hey, this is just fear-mongering. But instead, you hear a segment of the Democratic Party saying, well, we won't fund a wall, but we'll provide billions for border security on the U.S.-Mexican border. And what they're doing is they're saying, well, we won't actually participate in the right's racial fear-mongering, but in the context of staying silent on race, we're actually going to play into the idea that Democrats need to promise to keep people safe from these supposed threatening immigrant groups. The race forward folks say, knock it off. It's people of color, immigrants, Muslims, African Americans, Latino immigrants. We're not the ones making this country unsafe. We need to name the racism directly. And we also need to call for racial justice for these groups that are getting hurt.
Why, Ian, is it so persistent? I mean, how do you understand the origins of this debate?
The reason it's so persistent is because, well, one, as we've mentioned, this is what the GOP has been doing for the last 50 years. And two, neither of those responses works very well. And or put more bluntly, both of those responses largely fail to defeat the right's strategy of racial division. The colorblind response fails because it's the equivalent of saying, hey, the best player on the opposing basketball team, let's not guard him. Let's let him run the court, taking shots wherever he wants. Yes, racial division and racial fear is their best weapon. We'll ignore it. Well, good luck with that, right? But on the other hand, this race forward approach, the way the race forward approach has traditionally been pursued, has been to accuse Republicans of being racist, to insist that there is a white versus non-white divide in the country, to say that the country has a debt to communities of color. That sort of framing actually deepens the right's message. And the right's message is, we are a country fundamentally divided by race. There's a racial conflict going on. It's a zero-sum conflict. If one side does better, another side does worse. So if we're going to do things for people of color, that's going to hurt whites. The right's basic message is, hey, voter, when you go into that voting booth, you are choosing a racial team. Vote for your racial team. And when Democrats respond by saying, that's racist, we need to help communities of color, what a lot of whites hear is, they're calling me a racist, and they want me to sign up to help them, but they're not doing anything for me. And so what you see is this pattern in which the right uses race to divide us, and Democrats end up with two responses: call it out or ignore it, neither of which is effective. And here we are in 2019, hurtling into 2020. We can see that racial division is going to be the principal weapon, not just of Trump, but of Republicans all across the ballot. And once again, we're debating, should we ignore it or should we call them racist?
Dog Whistle Politics is a book that, I guess, is an answer to that debate, right? I mean, it's the result of 2 years or so of fascinating research. Can you tell us how you went about the research?
Sure, though let me clarify. So I wrote a book called Dog Whistle Politics in 2014 that laid out the history from the 60s to, at that point, 2014, saying, hey, here's how the right has weaponized racial division. After that, after Trump won, I realized we don't need more research, more analysis. We need research into what wins. So I teamed up with a communication specialist, with racial justice activists, with a union activist. And what we did is we said, we know that what the right does is it uses focus groups and poll testing in order to hone its winning messages. Let's do the same to figure out how to counteract dog whistling, how to counteract these coded messages of racial fear and threat. And what we came up with, and it was a remarkably successful research project. What we came up with was this a subtle but foundational shift. We have to be race forward. We have to challenge this racial division, but we cannot do it in a way that continues to reinforce the idea that race is fundamentally a conflict between whites and communities of color. Instead, we came up with this pivotal shift. Think about racial division as a weapon of the political class, of the billionaires, that's being used against all of us, brown, black, and white. Articulate a basic story of America that says we all want the same things for our families, for our children, for our aging parents, whatever race or community we come from. Some people seek to divide us and get us fighting each other. When they succeed in getting us to fight and fear each other, they can rig the rules for the billionaire class, taking away our health care, taking away good schools, taking away jobs and pensions. If we join together, we can protect each other and make this the society we want for all of our children, white, black, and brown. That message, that story, proved incredibly successful at overcoming the right's message of racial fear and resentment because it named it for what it was. This is divide and conquer politics. And if their main tactic is divide and conquer, then our main response needs to be to call for people to unite and build.
We're speaking with Ian Haney Lopez, law professor at the University of California, Berkeley, where he teaches in the areas of race and constitutional law, author of Merge Left, Fusing Race and Class, Winning Elections and Saving America, and also Dog Whistle Politics, How Coded Racial Appeals Have Reinvented Racism and Wrecked the Middle Class. Ian, what did your research tell you about which of these two messages can be successful as we approach the 2020 election?
The research says neither. It's when we say the two messages, I mean a sort of a colorblind approach or a version, a racist call-out strategy. The research is really clear. Racist call-out strategy alienates a lot of whites. Frankly, the research shows that it alienates a lot of people in communities of color too. The research is also quite clear. The ignore race doesn't work. Or it can't. It'll work if you've got a strong enough Democratic constituency, but that leaves about 30 states in dog whistle lockdown. Neither of these work. On the other hand, the research, and I should say not just the research, but the research has been in the field since 2018 and has been remarkably successful in the field in Minnesota. In Kentucky, in California, in Washington, this approach that says we're all in this together, we are going to fight racism because only by fighting racism and by creating a multiracial progressive movement can we take care of all of our families. That message really resonates. And not just with communities of color, but with many white voters, the majority of white voters as well. That's the message, I think, that can actually speak to our political movement and pull people together. And let me just emphasize this point. It's an incredibly important point. This is a message of unity that unifies an otherwise fractured left. And when I say left, I mean the broad left, but within the broad left, there are some people who say, hey, we need to just elect anybody but Trump. And there are other people who say, we need to avoid race and just focus on economics. That's the most important. And other people who say, we need to end mass incarceration, mass deportation, and that's the most important. This message of race and class fused together unifies the left because what it says is the weapon against all of us is racial division. And if you want to win, you have to overcome racial division. And if you want to create the majorities that will make Medicare for all or economic populism a realistic possibility, that requires a multiracial movement. And if you want to end mass incarceration and mass deportation, that requires a multiracial movement. Everything we want depends upon overcoming the principal weapon being used against us. That's racial division.
And this also is a book, Merge Left, is about why merging racial justice and economic justice is essential, not only to winning elections, but to achieving the goals that define economic populism. So what's the long-term transformative potential of race-forward politics?
That's such a great and such an important question. Yes, many of us are focused on, hey, how do we win in 2020? But this is coming within a longer trajectory of the United States struggling to overcome racial division. And the core insight here is racial division has been much more than just a way to harm communities of color. It's actually been one of the major impediments to the general advancement of the United States in terms of our ideals of government by and for the people. To the extent that we can be convinced that we're threatened by other people, that the we is not a complete we, but is a fractured and combative we. To that extent, we've seen our society hijacked by the billionaire class. This coming together across racial division, it's not just an electoral strategy. It's the way to restore our democracy and to create an economy that works for everyone. Because, and this is the crucial insight, our economy and our democracy thrive when we come closest to our ideal of government by and for the people. But we can only achieve that when the people truly means the people, all of the people, not limited by race or immigration status or religion or gender or sexual orientation. We have to believe in the project of building social solidarity around our shared identity as the people of the United States, who then take ownership, and claim responsibility for government to make sure that it actually works for us and not for corporations.
Now, of course, doing politics that merges race and class is hard work. It involves overcoming years of distrust and forming new coalitions. What do you see as the biggest hurdle politicians need to overcome to move forward on this agenda?
I think if the question is politicians, the biggest hurdle they need to overcome is the cautiousness, the conservatism of the campaign consultant class. Right, the consultant class, they're geared toward getting to 50% plus one. They're geared towards winning elections. They're, however radical the candidate, the consultant class is often quite cautious. But in a way, you know, the question isn't so much what should the politicians do. The politicians are going to do what they traditionally do, which is they're going to follow where the people are going. What we need is a conversation among all of us as Americans about what we want our country to look like. And we have to realize that we're having that conversation right now in the midst of, I mean, crisis is the wrong word, right? Because crisis is like, oh, this is, you know, bad things are happening. It's like, no, we've plummeted off the edge of a cliff. The country's really headed in the wrong direction. From the highs of the Great Society and civil rights, we have been sliding backwards, and our levels of wealth inequality increasing, levels of racial resentment increasing. This is a moment when, as Americans, we can look around and say, things have gone off the rails. This is not sustainable, and things have a chance of getting far worse. And in the midst of this emergency, we can also say to ourselves, we see a way forward. We see the way forward in confidence and connection with each other, undivided by race or gender or immigration. That's the way forward. Is it an easy way forward? No. Is it a guaranteed way forward? No. There's going to be hard work. There's going to be frustration. There's going to be some reversal. But I think we also see, and I think we can understand at a really intuitive level, we either come together now and reject division and really try and purposefully build connection with each other, or we will see our society shatter. It's so close. And I think that this is part of the reason this message of coming together really resonates with people. We are almost all Americans, whether whether you think of yourself as a Republican or Democrat or independent, almost all of us sense we are coming apart. And I think what's new here is we're saying, the reason we're coming apart is because some of the most powerful interests in our society benefit when we come apart, because that makes it easier for them to hijack government and rig the economy. Mm-hmm. Well, knock that off. Let's come together, and that's going to be hard, and we're going to have to give each other space and trust each other and overcome deeply internalized prejudices that we've grown up with since being little kids. Yeah, all of that. We don't have a choice. If we want to save our own families, whether we're white, black, brown, yellow, red, if we want to save our own families, we need to do the hard work of making connections across the divisions that have been weaponized against us.
Let's start having conversations right in our own neighborhoods, with different people from different walks of life, because they're all around us. They're everywhere. It's what makes up this country. So Ian Haney Lopez, law professor at the University of California, Berkeley, his most recent book, Merge Left, Fusing Race and Class, Winning Elections and Saving America, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Ian, very much enjoyed having you with us today. Would love to do it again sometime soon.
Thank you so much, and I look forward to joining you again.
Fantastic. Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks to New York Times columnist and Pulitzer Prize-winning author Tom Friedman on why he believes Donald Trump must be impeached if America's democracy is to remain intact.
Impeach Trump, save America. What prompted you to write that column? You don't usually get into domestic politics.
Well, I actually have. It's hard to really write meaningfully today about the world if you're not writing about domestic politics as well as foreign affairs. But basically, obviously, I've been following this all along, what's been going on. And I felt that it had reached a point in my head where I had to come down very clearly on what I believe. And what I believe is that if we allow a president to enlist a foreign power to intervene on our election on his behalf, using American military aid as the cudgel to do that, if we just turn away from that, but we will never have another legitimate election, because every president going forward will now have license to say, hey, Trump did it, so I'm going to list the Chinese, I'm going to list the Saudis, I'm going to list the Iranians, I'm going to list cyber experts in Czechoslovakia, wherever, on my behalf, number one. And number two, if we say a president can resist all subpoenas and can ban from testifying in a case involving him all his top aides who are the most knowledgeable about this case, people like John Bolton or Rudolph Giuliani, then we no longer live actually in a democracy. We live in a monarchy. That's what monarchies do. And henceforth, our country would be different. So what's at stake here is everything. It's actually the foundations of our constitutional democracy. Does a president have a right to enlist a foreign power to get himself elected? And having done that, committed any crime, does a president have a right to resist all subpoenas, both of documents and testimony, to ensconce himself in power? Well, this is everything.
And you use the phrase "save America."
Yeah.
You believe it's that serious?
Oh, I believe it's that serious. Yeah, I believe that if we erase those lines, Bill, between foreign intervention and an American election, and the line between separation of powers, of three co-equal powers, into monarchy, we're a different country. We're a different America. And boy, you will miss the one we had when it's gone.
Have you heard from friends at the State Department or the White House today?
No, they don't. The Trump people don't. The president attacked me on Twitter once a while back, but they don't reach out to me in any way, shape, or form.
What do you say to the argument, well, this is all wrong. Let the voters decide. Let's wait until November 2020.
I totally agree with that argument, which is why I ask myself, why was the President of the United States using American tax dollars to induce the President of Ukraine to launch an investigation against his presumed rival in the 2020 election, his most feared rival, in the hopes that by doing so it would kill his campaign in the crib? What the hell was Trump doing but subverting the will of the people for 2020? So when Republicans say, why, the people should decide to remove a president through elections, not the Congress, I totally agree, except in a case where the president's deeds are in effect undermining the very framework for free and fair elections. And that's precisely why the founders said, yes, presidents should be elected and removed by the popular vote. But there will be cases where a president begins to act like a monarch, which is what they feared most, in which case said person must be impeached, or a mechanism has to be created to impeach him.
So we are now pretty much 3 years of the Donald Trump presidency.
Can I say one more thing on that?
Yes, please.
And the founders didn't say, if you actually, as a president, break the law in the last 9 months before an election, that's okay. That's okay. But not 10 months. 10 months, no. And your first year, never. No. They said we are a country of laws, not of men or women. And so this is open and shut for me.
Right.
And so everything's at stake here. Is there something I'm missing? Is there something more about the sanctity of our country, the sustenance of our democracy, than having free and fair elections and a separation of powers? What are we other than that? Just a flag? Just a territorial entity? Those are the two unique features of our system: the separation of powers and free and fair elections. We lose those, we're Russia, we're China, we're Egypt, we're Turkey.
So we're just for all practical purposes, 3 years into the Donald Trump presidency. Is there a Trump foreign policy? And if so, what is it?
Is there a Trump foreign policy?
Is it America first? Is it America alone?
It's sort of America first. It's sort of America alone. It's sort of other people need to be paid more, that every country in the world is sort of like a dim sum restaurant in Trump Tower. Hey, pal, you're not paying enough rent, But what there isn't is an animating principle that we're here to spread decency. We're here to spread democracy. We're here to promote global trade and commerce. There's just kind of a cranky, you're not paying enough, and your trade is stealing my trade. Now, by the way, there's things here that I have sympathy with. We needed to rebalance our trade relationship with China. I've supported the president on that in principle. I would have done it tactically very different. But what there is, it's a kind of mercantilist, old style, this is just about money. Either you're not paying enough rent for an organization Trump doesn't even particularly seem to be affectionate toward, NATO, or your trade is unbalanced with ours. But there isn't a sense that the world will be a better place if more governments share these values.
Is the American president still the leader of the free world?
In theory, the American president is still the leader of the free world. But Donald Trump is not. We are in a post-American world right now. And what I mean by that is my friend Fareed Zakaria, a decade ago, wrote a book about the post-American world. And what he really meant was a world where American power would no longer be so supreme, that there would be what he called the rise of the rest, and that we'd be post-American in the sense that we couldn't just call the shots the way we had before. I think we're in a post-American world now in a different way. We're in a world where America, as the arbiter of truth and the promoter of trust, really the two ingredients of a stable world, and by the way, of stable democracy, truth and trust, that America is no longer with us anymore. You can't have an America that is the arbiter of truth when the president lies as he breathes. You can't have an America that is the generator of trust when we're constantly attacking people and calling others names, and when no one knows when we'll pull the rug out from under them with a tweet. And so in that sense, we're in a post-American world, and it's disorienting people, Bill. People have never lived in this world. You and I haven't lived in this world. We've only known a world where America was the basic organizer of global coalitions to combat communism or climate change, and where America was the arbiter of what's true out there. No, you Russians, you're lying about that issue, whatever it is. Or no, the science says this. And so when the world no longer has that America, it's actually very disorienting for people.
A couple of specific cases. Did Donald Trump make a mistake in pulling out of the Paris climate deal?
Oh, there's no question, in my view. It's not that the Paris
Again,
climate
in terms
deal,
of our leadership in the world.
It wasn't that the Paris climate deal was the be-all and the end-all but it was a global framework that sent the signal that mitigating climate change was important, okay? And that not only went out to governments, and people went out to every company. All right, the Americans in the world now say this, I better get a sustainability officer. We better have a carbon policy. We better think about our carbon footprint. But when America pulls out, every other country can use it to say, hey, if they're not going to do it, I'll just pollute as much as I want.
Same question, the Iran nuclear deal.
So, the Iran nuclear deal, I would not have done it the way he did it. Or if I did it, what I would have done. Let's just step back for a second. Trump has chosen to take on two of the oldest civilizations on the planet at the same time, Persia and China, okay? And in both cases, he created enormous leverage on them, on China through tariffs and on Persia through oil sanctions and the scrapping of the Iran nuclear deal. To me, it's all about what you do with that leverage. So had he done that and then come to the Iranians and say, look, I just want two things. I want this Iran nuclear deal was for 15 years, basically, the true denuclearization part of it. I want to make that for 30 years, number one. And number two, I want to limit all your missile testing to the radius of the Middle East. That's all. I just want those two things. Had he done that, Bill, he would have triggered the biggest fight in Tehran between moderates and hardliners you can imagine. Because, look, we got to take. They used to take away all our own. We got to take this, okay? And but instead, by going basically for regime change, basically putting down a list of 9 or 10 conditions that were tantamount to regime change, he made it very easy for this to be him versus Iran rather than the world versus Iran on the issue of denuclearization and anti-ballistic missiles. And as a result of that, he forces all the Iranian people to wave the flag of the regime because he makes it just this black and white thing. I would say the same thing is what he's done with China.
On the world stage, and you've written about that, it's remarkable that Donald Trump does not seem to be too friendly with people who have been our longtime allies, Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron, even though Macron's not been there that long. But he's very buddy-buddy with Erdogan and Putin and Kim Jong-un and Modi.
Yeah. It's clear he likes autocrats. He likes people.
What's that all about?
I think he's got, autocrat envy. He really wishes he was unrestrained. As
he's their model, basically.
Yeah.
They're his model.
Yeah, he really would like to be able, and he said this jokingly, but I think more truth is said in jest here, And with Putin, I have no idea what's there, but it's so unusual. His deference to Putin, his readiness to take Putin's side on so many issues like Ukraine, his denial of our own intelligence community's conclusions about Russia's intervention in our life. It's so clear that either he's just totally infatuated with Putin and in awe of him, or the Russians have something on him. I have no idea, but this is not normal behavior of an American president, and we should never normalize it.
The person who is responsible, supposedly, in the administration for foreign policy, of course, is the Secretary of State. What is your take on the job Pompeo's doing?
I think that Pompeo will go down as the worst Secretary of State in the post-war era, topping even Tillerson, who Tillerson was just inept. But what Pompeo has done is positively reprehensible. He stood by while Trump and Giuliani shot his diplomats in the back, fired the ambassador from Ukraine for absolutely no reason other than that Ukrainian thugs in alliance with Giuliani, thought she was getting in their way with her own anti-corruption programs in Kiev. And Pompeo knew that. Pompeo knew that she was doing a good job. How do we know that, Bill? Because his own deputy, Mr. Sullivan, in his hearing to become the U.S. ambassador to Moscow, told us that she was doing her job and she was doing it well. He told us that she was ousted because of Rudolph Giuliani, his own deputy, the guy who sits down the hall from him a few feet, told us that. So despite that, the man who we're told always graduated number one in his class from West Point evidently missed the course on ethics, loyalty, and leadership, because he let his own people get shot in the back.
By the way, who do you think were the better Secretary of States in the post-war era? Republican or Democrat? Which ones do you think really stand out?
Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Jim Baker, certainly all come to my mind very readily.
One thing, perhaps, that a lot of us could agree on with Donald Trump on is his argument against what he calls endless wars. Now, I'm not saying he's done a lot about it, but is he right to say we ought to pull our troops out of Afghanistan, particularly after what we learned this week?
Sure. I think there's a case for that. I supported the Iraq War for democracy reasons. I was actually never into the Afghan war. I believed if you changed Afghanistan, you changed Afghanistan. I believed if you changed Iraq, you forged an alliance between Sunni Shiites and Kurds, you changed the whole Middle East. That didn't end well, and that's a whole another radio show. But to me, Afghanistan, I just was never a believer in the process, the possibility of transforming Afghanistan. Most of all, I was never a believer in the value. That Afghanistan is living in a sort of blind alley somewhere, and we kind of got in there to remove al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, and then somehow slipped into this other mission, and it could have ended a long time ago. If we got out tomorrow in the right way, obviously, the people have helped us. We need to secure their future, and so I support the president doing that.
Right. 18 years, $2 trillion.
Yeah,
whatever
it's appalling.
Right.
The Post piece was amazing on that.
Bill Press talking with New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Emmanuel Saez, Ian Haney Lopez, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter. And leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.